The last video I want to make for this concept of microevolution and how natural selection can lead to changes in the frequencies of alleles in a population, or the frequencies of genotypes can also be in a population, is how exactly natural selection can work. And so there are certain modes of natural selection we must recognize now. So I'm going to go to my presentation that I've been using for explaining these concepts. And one of the forms natural selection can take is going to be directional selection. And directional selection simply means that given a population with a range of variation for a specific trait, such as it can be the color of the fur in an animal. We are now familiar with mice that live in the desert and how they have different tones, different coloration for their fur. Let's imagine that we have a place where most mice are going to have an intermediate fur color. I want to go to my laser pointer function. Okay, I think I got it now. So here we have a mouse with a fur that is going to be intermediate. Now you can see that there's going to be other mice that are going to have a darker color and some that are going to have a real dark color, like the ones living among those lava rocks in the southern desert in the United States. So what would happen in this situation is that given this variation, given this normal distribution of fur colors, where you may have had at some point in time most mice having an intermediate color, over time as predators are finding these mice more easily, but those with the darker fur color are surviving better because they are not easily spotted, natural selection will shift the color of those mice over in the direction of those with a darker fur. As you've learned before, mice that live in those dark lava rocks and have this darker fur color have a higher chance of survival and eventually reproduction. So this shift is going to be in one direction. Individuals in one extreme are going to be the ones that are going to be most successful at surviving and reproducing. And that is one way in which natural selection can proceed. Another one is going to be diversifying selection. It could be that the place where animals live or plants live favors both extremes of a phenotype. Those in the middle are not doing well, so selection is against individuals with an intermediate phenotype. And I have an example that I can tell you here. So in another animal that I used to study when I was in grad school in California was the California tree frog. And there are similar frogs to those California tree frogs. The genus is Hyla. There are several Hyla species of frog that live also here in the state of Washington. But Hyla cadaverina, that is a scientific name for the California tree frog. You can find them in places where you have vernal pools in the spring and you have like puddles of water that form just for the spring. And those puddles of water are going to be surrounded by green grass. Those frogs that are living there among the grass near the water are going to have a bright green coloration. Others do better by moving sometimes a short distance from the puddle of water. There's going to be a tree, and those California tree frogs actually go and they like to live on the bark of tree, and the bark of trees usually has like a dark gray color. And so you have these frogs that are surviving and doing well when they have this light but bright green coloration, and frogs that are going to be with the darker coloration like the barks of the trees. What would happen to a frog that is not as light and green and is not as gray, maybe some kind of like an intermediate grayish, greenish color? Well, they are going to stand out more than the other members of the population, and perhaps those will be the ones that will be more likely to be picked birds can feed on frogs, snakes can feed on frogs. There's a number of predators that frogs can have. And so when both extremes of a phenotype have the advantage, we call this diversifying selection or disruptive selection. That is another name we use as well. And so please add this to your notes: diversifying or disruptive selection. Another mode of selection we can find is stabilizing selection. And in stabilizing selection, what happens is that most of the members of the population surviving and doing well are going to be those in an intermediate type of a phenotype. What happens to one extreme or the other extreme? Those with extreme phenotypes are being selected against through natural selection by the environment. And so those with an intermediate trait are going to be the ones that survive. And there's a question that you see in the PowerPoint presentation that I posted, and it's going to be a good way of showing you what happens with regards to selection. So there's this example of flies that are going to be laying their eggs on a plant known as a goldenrod. It's just one of those flowering plants people can put on their front yards, depending on what part of the country and the climate that favoring the goldenrod. So goldenrod plants are going to be attacked by flies, and the attack is by means of having an egg from the fly being deposited into their young stems. The plant responds to this type of an attack by forming like a mass of cells. It kind of looks like a tumor. We call it a gall. The gall, as you can see over here, is this massive, amount of tissue. And it doesn't really hurt the plant to do this. They're using this kind of like their own defense. But in reality, what the plant does, and they don't know this, of course, is that they end up helping the fly because the larvae of the fly will feed from the material that the gall is made from. So they'll be feeding on that plant material. So what scientists have studied is and determined is that smaller flies are going to be laying their eggs in a way that they produce a smaller gall. The plant responds by making a smaller gall. Larger flies are going to be leading the plant to produce a larger gall. Larger flies are going to be producing also larvae that are going to be larger. And so what happens in this case? Let's take a look at the one extreme. The very small flies, they make small galls, and those are going to be usually parasitized by a wasp that comes and lays the eggs. And this is a dog-eat-dog world, if you know what I mean. So the parasite was the fly, but here comes a wasp, which is also going to rely on parasitism. When this wasp lays an egg, the larvae of the wasp will hatch and will eat the larva of the fly. So that's what happens with the small size galls, which have smaller larvae from the smaller flies. Let's move to the other extreme. What happens to the larger flies? I told you those will produce larger larvae that will lead to a larger gall, and that's what the downy woodpeckers, so it's a beautiful bird, it's a woodpecker with mostly a black coloration, but they also have white on their chest. It makes them pretty. It's a downy woodpecker. They like to feed on the larvae of flies, but they only bother to open the larger galls. Larger galls have larger fly larvae inside, and so there's a greater reward. So you see what happens? Larger flies with the larger larvae are selected against because they are eaten by the downy woodpecker. The smaller flies, which produce smaller larvae and grow in a smaller gall, those are going to be parasitized by the larvae of a wasp. Who survives? You got it. The ones that have an intermediate. So what do we call this type of selection? You have three choices. Stabilizing, disruptive. I said disruptive also means that same as diversifying, or directional. And if you answer disruptive, you answer correctly. It's disruptive or I'm sorry, that would have been wrong. It's a stabilizing selection. The intermediate, I have to correct myself here. Stabilizing selection is the right answer here, because only the intermediate flies, which produce the intermediate size larvae, those are going to be the ones that are surviving. B and C would be incorrect answers for this question here.